All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Here's what's happening right. Well, first of all, did anyone seek to talk to you about the case or anything of that nature during your lunch break? And you certainly did not look at any information or anything of that nature. You're going to get asked that question every time, as you know. There's some things right outside in the hall that Mr. Jarvis and his client are going to be dealing with. It may take 3 or 4 minutes, and so just bear with us. It's something they just brought to my attention. I thought it was the right thing to let them step outside and deal with. And so in just about 3 or 4 minutes, we'll resume. All right, we're finding Mr. Jarvis. You ready to proceed now, gentlemen?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Ward, are we ready to proceed? All right.
Miss Hatler, is it Mrs. or Mrs.?
Mrs.
Mrs. Hatler. Yeah, as you know, my name is Scott Work. We've met before, is that correct?
Yes.
At your deposition?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the DNA analysis that you did in this case, okay? First, I'm going to start off with some basic stuff. In order to make calculations and to make conclusions about a DNA sample, you have to first make conclusions about how many donors there are. Is that correct?
Yes. For an unknown sample, yes.
Right. Okay. And I heard today you talk about both the B20B and the B20E. How many donors did you determine were at B20B?
For B20B, I determined that there were 3 contributors to the sample.
Okay. And how many contributors did you determine were in the B20E sample?
For this sample, I determined that there were 2 with a possible additional contributor.
So 2 plus a possible additional contributor. So that means 3, is that correct?
It could mean 3, or it could mean that I have information from the instrument or background noise that I wasn't totally 100% sure if I could determine that there was 2 or 3.
Okay. But another reasonable analyst could determine that it's 3 donors.
Yes, I would think that there could be different interpretations.
And I know you talked about this a little bit with Mr. Drake, but I just want to go over this concept again, because this is going to come into play in just a few minutes. As we've seen, you have a location, or what you call a loci, for each place you test for in the DNA. Is that correct?
Yes, I was calling them genetic markers.
Right. So like, for example, there's a genetic marker called D3S1 358, and I think a lot of times you guys just call it D3S, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you're going to get alleles, 1 allele from each parent, correct?
Yes.
And so sometimes you can get, like, for example, I put on this slide, you can get a 16 from one parent and a 16 from the other parent, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And sometimes you can get, say, 14 from your mom and 15 from your dad, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And when we use the word homozygote and heterozygote, that's what we're meaning, correct? Homozygote means you got the same thing from both of them.
That's right.
Okay. And heterozygote means you got a different thing from both of them.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Now, when DNA analysts are doing interpretations, I know there's more levels than the 4, but you've seen this slide before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And in the DNA interpretation levels, at the top is a match. I've got confidence in my data, and I've got confidence that this matches someone, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you can go, sometimes you can have a problem with the data and have less confidence in it, and you can only make what's called an inclusion. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say it's a problem. It just, there could be more than one person in the sample, and to where I can't determine who is contributing most of the DNA. So it's a complete mixture to where I would include someone in the sample.
But when you say include, it doesn't mean that you're saying their DNA is included in the sample. What you mean is you're including them as people, as a person who could have possibly put DNA into that sample. Is that correct?
Right, that they're possibly included in the mixture.
But that also means that DNA could possibly come from someone else, correct?
Well, it depends on the sample and what the DNA information is.
But if you say that someone is included in the population of people that could put the DNA in that sample, that's the same thing as saying it could be that person or it could be someone else that put that DNA, correct?
Well,
Not everyone.
if it's a mixture, then there would be someone else included in it because there would be two people.
But when you say a person is included, you're not saying they definitely left DNA. You're just saying it's possible they left the DNA.
Right.
But it's possible someone else could have.
Well, I would provide a statistic to show that the possibility is relevant to the statistic.
But if it's only possible that someone is included, then that means it's possible someone else that would be consistent with that sample, someone else consistent with that sample is the person who left the DNA, correct?
Yes, how the statement says it's, the statistic would be the chances of randomly selecting someone in the population that could be a contributor to the sample.
Now I'm going to go down the next level that I have listed here. You can have less data or less confidence in your data, and you can exclude someone. Is that correct?
Well, I can exclude someone from a single source or lots of data or less data, and I can exclude.
Right. Exclusion could happen with the same level of data that you use for inclusion and the same level you use for match, correct?
Yes.
In other words, I'm kind of moving down the chain here. Then you can have situations where you have data that you believe for some reason is not interpretable, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I just want to reiterate, when an analyst says someone is included, it doesn't mean their DNA is included. It simply means that they could possibly be someone from the population who could have left that DNA, correct?
I don't know if I'm understanding.
When you say-
The statistic is where you would randomly select a person out of the population and that they could be a possible contributor to that sample.
But only a possible.
Right.
And I want to talk about analytical threshold for a minute. Every kit and machine combination at the Pensacola lab, they have an analytical threshold, correct?
Yes, our instruments each have one.
Right. And I believe in this case, you used an identifier plus kit,
Yes.
okay? And you used the 3130 machine, is that correct?
Yes.
And for that combination, for what you did in this case, the analytical threshold is 50, correct?
Yes.
And when I say 50, we're talking about the numerical peak height, correct?
It's the scale of the peaks. Yeah.
Right, that we saw in the electropharograms.
Yes.
Okay. Now, there's also another threshold above that. Similarly, every kit combination and machine combination in the Pensacola lab have a stochastic threshold, correct?
When this testing was originally done with the first kit that I mentioned, we did not have a stochastic threshold, but from the time that I took the case over, we did.
You're talking about when Curtis Browning was doing stuff before you.
Right, he was
Right.
the first analyst.
Okay. I'm talking about when you did when you did all of the B20 samples, correct?
Yes.
That was, the stochastic threshold was 300, correct? Okay. And you also did, I believe it was item B1, which was the pants, is that correct?
I have the pajamas as B2.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's, okay, B2. So all of the analysis that we're talking about today, other than the stuff that Curtis Browning did, such as Melissa Howard's standard, they were all done using the 3130 identifier plus, and the stochastic threshold is 300. Is that correct?
Well, for the 3130 instrument, I could perform two different injection times of the samples, how long they're injected into the instrument to see the data. So if I had done a 10-second injection, it would be 150 was the stochastic. If I had done a longer injection, a 22-second injection, it was 300. I think for the majority of the samples, I did the longer injection, so it would be 300.
I think we're going to, what I'm trying to get at is that probably everything we're going to look at today is going to have a 300 stochastic threshold, correct?
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, if we see something that you think has a different threshold, let me know, okay? Okay. Now, there's an agency called SWGDAM, is that correct?
Yes.
And what does that stand for?
It's a scientific working group on DNA analysis methods. It's a group of individuals from a variety of different laboratories that contribute to making guidelines for laboratories to use for the nation.
And SWGDAM makes recommendations to the FBI biology people, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And the FBI biology people take those recommendations and they create guidelines, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then those guidelines get pushed down to the law enforcement labs, is that correct?
Certain laboratories will use these guidelines, yes.
Does the FDLE use these FBI guidelines?
Yes, they do.
And you're required to in order to use the CODIS database, pretty much, is that right?
Yes.
And SWGDAM states that when data is at or below that stochastic threshold, that 300 threshold, there's uncertainty in the ability to correctly call allele pairs. The uncertainty to correctly call allele pairs, that goes up. Is that right?
Yes, it's suggested to be cautious if there's peaks that are below the stochastic threshold.
So when you go below the stochastic threshold, uncertainty goes up.
Yes.
SWGDAM also states that when an allele that's foreign to the victim is below the stochastic threshold, dropout of the second allele of the person of interest is considered reasonable. Is that correct?
That's a possibility.
Okay. This means that when data is below the stochastic threshold, that dropout of alleles is very common. Is that right?
That can happen, yes.
Is it very common?
It all depends on the samples.
But it's not rare.
No, it happens.
You see dropout all the time, don't you?
With older cases, yes. Not necessarily with some of the newer cases. It depends on the type of sample and the evidence.
And there were two different biology standard operating procedures that were sort of in place during the time when you were working on the B20E, which is the sweatshirt, and I believe it was B2, which was the pajama pants. Is that correct? I think it was, you see on the, see you're looking.
Yeah, I think these are correct.
Right. So BioSOP, or Biology Standard Operating Procedure 15 and 16. One was April 3rd, 2015. One was February 5th, 2016. Is that correct?
I don't remember. I think so.
And the FDLE definition of stochastic threshold that's in there is, for stochastic threshold, is the minimum peak height at which an allele may be called a homozygote or considered homozygous for statistical analysis. Is that correct?
Yes.
What that means is if you have a peak that goes above that stochastic line, that you feel pretty confident, and you only have one peak, you feel pretty confident that it's only one peak and that person got the same information for both their mother and father, correct?
Yes, the stochastic threshold would give you the ability to determine that it is like a 15-15 versus a 15 something else.
Right. And that's the minimum peak height according to the FDLE definition, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Similarly, you have what's called a stochastic effect that's in your standard operating procedure. And the stochastic effect is defined as the unequal sampling of alleles, which may result in allelic dropout, apparent preferential or differential amplification, or other unexplained imbalances within or between loci, often associated with low-level template DNA. Is that the correct definition of stochastic effect?
I think so, yes.
Okay. And what that means is sometimes you'll have something called drop-in. Is that right?
That's right. It's rare.
Right. It's rare. Okay. You have dropout. That's much more common, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then you also have peak height imbalances. That's common, correct?
It can be, yes.
If you're below the stochastic threshold.
That can happen, yes.
Right. Much more common when you're below the stochastic threshold.
There again, it kind of depends on the samples.
And the FDLE defines something as being imbalanced if one peak is less than 50% of the other one for a foreign donor, correct?
For any sample,
Okay.
a single source or a mixture.
So anytime you've got a pair that's less than 50%, a pair of peaks, like what we saw in the electrophorograms, that are less than 50% of each other, they're considered imbalanced, correct?
Yes.
Okay. If I could approach the witness, Your Honor. Okay. Ms. Hatler, I've got here 1,170, 1,185, 14,186, and 14,000. I'm going to go through them one at a time.
Okay.
Page number 14,174, that is an AMP positive electropharogram. Is that correct?
Yes.
And page 14,185, that is 14,186. Those are the electropharograms, first and second page. Is that correct?
If I, yes.
And I believe the state had already entered the caution I'm putting. Then page 14,157, that is an STR summary sheet.
Yes.
You're right, Your Honor, at this time, I would move to put 4 into evidence.
Any objection? D1 through 4 are in without objection.
What I have here on the screen is, on the left side, is page 14,174, which is the AMP positive control. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I just put this in to use it as an example. At D21S1, at the top left up here, I wanted to show that is well above the stochastic threshold. Is that correct? That 30, it's 2004.
Yes.
Okay, so the peak height is 2004.
Yes.
So, and the AMP positive control, let me back up. That's something that you put in every time you run a sample through. It's just it's a known DNA that has really nothing to do with the case. Is that correct?
Right. It's just to show that the process, the PCR, and running it through the genetic analyzer is working correctly. So I run this every time. I know what to expect when I get the result.
Right. And if you get something, you get a sheet from the ANT positive control that's different than what this sheet is, you know something went wrong and you got to backtrack.
Yes.
Okay. I'm just using this sheet just to demonstrate. You know that that's a homozygote right there at D2S1 because it's well above the stochastic threshold of 300, correct?
Yes.
And so you only got one peak, it's a 30-30.
Yes.
Okay. And the homozygote that I picked is this 1415 right down here at D3S1. You know that, I'm sorry, the heterozygote that I chose is the 1415 at D3S1. You have two peaks. Both of them are substantially above the stochastic threshold of 300. You're pretty confident, and they're balanced. The 986 is greater than 50% of the 14, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so you're pretty confident that they go together?
Yes.
Okay. Now, and what I've done here is I placed red lines on that same page 14174 that represent where the stochastic threshold would basically be in relation to those peak heights. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Now, I want to talk about, let's move what we're here about, B20E. That's the sample that you have given the opinion is a match to Russell. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree with me that these are the two pages that I just gave you and put into evidence, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I've just put red lines on there that approximate where the stochastic threshold. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I know it's a little difficult to see, but in each of these, your scale on the left-hand side goes from 0 to 330. Is that correct?
Yes, for this is where I had zoomed in to where I could see better and do some math.
Right. And so I've put that line about 1/3 of the way between the 330 and the 220. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you're okay with that's right there where around 300 should be.
Yes.
Okay. Now, right here, at D5, it's D8S, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Right there at D8S, that's the only place where you have a peak of foreign DNA that is above the stochastic threshold, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We see a lot of peaks. Went to the other side. Okay. Now, we see a peak there and a peak there. And those are peaks that belong to Melissa Howard, correct?
Yes, the 2832.2.
Right. What I am concerned about, and we see all the way along, we see peaks that go right off this chart because you've got it zoomed in, right?
Right, those would be Melissa Howard's peaks.
Right, that's where I'm going. Those are all Melissa Howard's. So for all these other peaks that we see on there that you believe to be foreign DNA, they are all below the stochastic threshold, correct?
Yes.
Okay. On the left-hand side, that's the STR summary sheet at page 14,157, correct?
This is one of them.
Right, well, one of them. There were others. That's fair. Okay. And on the right-hand side is page 1 of the electropharogram, of the B20E electropharogram. It is You can't see it on the screen, but it's page number 14,185, correct?
Yes.
And similarly, and that approximates, again, that the red lines approximate the stochastic threshold. And I'm going to go, there's page 14,186, which is the second page of the B20 electropharogram. And again, it's next to that STR summary sheet, and the red line approximates the stochastic threshold. We agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I just want to make sure, I'm going to go back and talk about imbalance for a second. At FDLE, when using the identifier plus, which is the kits in this case, anytime a peak height has, anytime the peak height in relation to another is less than 50%, that's what we define as imbalanced, right?
Yes.
Okay. And this is particularly important when you're below the stochastic threshold, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to talk about, I'm going to just walk you through a little bit like what Mr. Drake did. I want to talk about D8S first. Okay. At D8S, like we talked about, that 15 is the only peak that's above stochastic threshold. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And you wrote a 15, or I'm sorry, you typed a 15 on that STR summary sheet. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that, when you typed this STR summary sheet, it was on September 23rd, 2015. We know that from the date at the top left. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I've just cut some places out that I'm of that page, but you agree that that's from page 14,157?
Yes.
Okay. And you didn't, and so since you got a peak there that's above the stochastic threshold, you should be confident that that's a homozygote, right?
Well, not necessarily. I wasn't sure if it would go with the 11 or the 13, or be a 15-15, or potentially go with stutter. And since it's just right above the stochastic threshold, I was worried that maybe it is an older sample, that I could still also be losing information. So I put the 15 plus, and that is where I based my statistical calculations from.
I'm going to move down to D20S. You typed in a 2930, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Then down at D7S, you typed in a 10 and 11, correct?
Yes.
Then over here at CSF, you wrote in a 13.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't see a 13 on this 14,185 electropharogram.
Right.
Where did that 13 come from?
For this sample, I did the PCR process where I make all the copies. I did it again, and I targeted a higher amount. And from that, I was getting more information, but I wasn't totally sure if it was reliable. It was more the max that the sample could go, as well as what the instrument could go. So I hand wrote in the 13 because that was what was different from the 11-12 that I obtained. But I wasn't sure if that was a true peak or if it was that artifact that I spoke about earlier with stutter. So I just hand wrote that in.
So you did another amplification of B20E, is that correct?
Yes.
And we're going to talk about amplification 2 later on. Okay, and I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Later on, you did another amplification of B20E where you put more DNA into the tube before you amplified it. Would that be fair?
Amplifying is the same as doing the PCR where I'm making the copies. So yes, I did that, but for my comparisons, I used the original sample to make my comparisons.
My question was, you did a second amplification of B20E that we're going to talk about later. You did a second amplification of B20E, correct?
Yes.
And when you did that amplification, you put more DNA into the tube before you amplified it.
Yes,
And at D3s, you typed in 14 and 16, correct?
yes,
Okay. And then and you wrote a 15 in from the other amplification, correct?
yes,
Similarly, I believe y'all called this THO1, is that correct?
yes,
Okay, you put down that the foreign DNA was 8 and a 9.3, correct?
yes,
And at D13, you typed in that it was an 8 and a 9, is that correct?
yes,
And then at D16, you typed in a 10 and 11,
yes,
a 7, and then at D2S, you typed in a 17 and a 20.
yes,
And then you didn't find any foreign DNA at D19, is that correct?
right. There was nothing different than Melissa Howard.
Right. And, I mean, while it looks like what we see there, those other little peaks are so far below the stochastic threshold, you can't use them, right?
Well, those fell into the stutter peaks, so they would be a 13, 15, but the filters for this are in use, so it doesn't call those peaks.
When you say the filters, you mean the filters in the GMapper software? It automatically pulls those out for you if they're way low and they're in the stutter position under the stochastic threshold. Is that correct?
Sort of. That's it's based off of the percentage of the main big peak. So it's not really because it's below the stochastic, because sometimes they can also get above the stochastic, but right, for this, since they are below, it was filtered out based off of the percentage.
Right. I believe you testified that stutter's about 6 to 12% of the main peak that it's next to, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So these are less than 6% of those two main peaks of Melissa Howard. Therefore, you consider those to be stutter.
Yes.
So no DNA there.
Right, nothing foreign.
Nothing foreign there at D19. The same thing for VWA. Those two peaks are in the stutter position because they're below 6% of Melissa Howard's two main peaks.
Yes.
And what that means is, and you get a big peak like that, when it replicating this DNA, sometimes it leaves a little bit just before it at that stutter position, correct?
Right.
And then you found no foreign DNA at TPOX, is that correct?
Correct.
And similarly, back here on VWA, no foreign DNA, correct?
Correct.
And then at D18S, I see that you wrote a 13 in,
Yes.
but you didn't type one in. So we don't have, on the B20E, the first amplification that you said you used for statistics, you did not find any foreign DNA at D18, is that correct?
Right.
But you did find a 13 at D18 when you did the second amplification. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. Here you wrote down the Y as the foreign DNA because everybody's got an X. Is that correct?
Yes,
Right.
but that came up in the second amplification.
And similarly, just to finish this out, at D5S, you typed in an 11 and 13. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then at FGA, you typed in a 22. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But you wrote in a 25 that you found on the second amplification when you used more DNA.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to focus in on a decision that you made here at D21 and D7, okay? I notice in your STR summary sheet, you put a 29 and 30 in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. You typed it in. But out to the side in the black handwriting, you wrote a 30 plus. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you testified earlier that you threw this 29 out. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say I threw it out.
You didn't use it.
Well, I was concerned. I didn't know if it was a true peak from an individual or if it was from instrument.
This is important, isn't it? But let me ask it this way. This is important because Russell Holbrook does not have a 29 at D21. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So if that 29 goes with that 30, that DNA doesn't belong to David Russell Holbrook, is that correct?
It depends on how many people we're assuming in the sample.
So that goes back to, is it 2 people in the sample or 3 people in the sample?
I was determining, before I had any standards, that it was 2 people, and then even in my notes, I stated that there could be a third, or was it other limited data?
So before you got a standard, it was 2 people, is that correct?
Well, I still thought that there could be an indication of a third, but I felt good about the 2-person.
Okay. So if it's a 2-person sample, and that's what your conclusion was before you got Russell Holbrook's standard, and that 29 and 30 go together, he's excluded from that DNA sample, isn't he?
Well, he does not have a 29, and I wasn't sure if that was a true peak or not, so that's why I went with the 30 plus.
You want to ask the question?
I'm going to ask the question again, Your Honor. I'm going to be patient with it. If that 29 goes with that 30 at E21, then Russell Holbrook would be excluded from leaving that foreign DNA sample. Is that correct?
That's correct. He does not have the 29.
Okay. And it was I'm trying to find a way to move that. Right here, similarly, I'm going to go to D7S. D7S. You decided that that was a 10 and 11. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that 10 and 11, they're 35.7% in balance, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the 29 and 30 are 31.5% imbalanced. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So you throw away something that's 31.5% imbalanced, but you keep something that's 35% imbalanced. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say I threw it away. I still knew that it was present.
Well, then let me ask it this way. You decided that the 29 and 30 didn't go together, despite the fact that they're 31.5% of each other, but you kept the 10 and 11 right next to it that were 35.7%. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And I believe I heard you testify earlier, we're talking about D2S, the 29 and 30, because that's important. I believe I heard you testify earlier that that could be stuttered. Is that right?
Well, stutter can go in both directions, but it would be very low amount, a very small percentage if it goes in the other direction.
Okay. And you testified that stutter is 6 to 12% of the larger peak to the right of it. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll give you 12%. 12% of that 219, that would be a 27 peak height, correct?
What I guess I meant to say is the stutter, it's a smaller percentage if it goes the other direction, that stutter peak is from the 28. That can happen as well, but it's much smaller percent.
I heard you testify that, and I believe I heard you testify, that you were saying that that stutter was 6 to 12%. That 29 was 6 to 12% stutter from that 30.
That can happen, yes.
Okay. And 219, if I take 12%, is 27. Is that correct?
I guess so.
What would be 10% of 219? 21.9?
Yes,
Okay. And if we add, and what's 1% of 219? 2.2?
yes,
Okay, so if we add 2.2 plus 2.2, that's 4.4? 4.4 plus 21.9, that's just a little over 26, correct?
okay,
Okay, so I just add 10%, 1%, and 1%. That's 12%, correct?
yes,
Okay, so 27 would be 12%. And half of that, 13 or 14, would be 6%. Is that correct?
yes.
Okay. But this is 31.5%. You wrote it right there on the sheet. Not 12 or not 6%.
I was just recording what the peak imbalance was.
Okay. And again, this is important because Russell Holbrook does not have a 29 at D21. Is that correct?
That's correct, he does not.
I want to talk about a decision that you made at D3s. D3s, you had a 14 and a 16, is that correct?
Yes,
Now, those are 48%, 48.6%. Is that right?
yes,
Okay. So you had a 14 and a 16 you typed in. Is that right?
yes,
Okay. And you wrote in a 15 that you found from the other amplification that we're going to look at in just a minute. Is that right?
yes,
Okay. And this is important also, isn't it?
yes,
Okay. But right here, you didn't call that 14-16 a pair. I believe you testified that you determined it to be a 16 plus, meaning a 16 is something else. Is that right?
Well, in the long run, I didn't end up using it at all for comparison purposes.
But this is what you wrote on the summary sheet, correct?
Yes,
You didn't even use D3s for comparison purposes. Is that correct?
well, I misspoke. I didn't use it for statistic purposes. I did use it to compare.
Okay. And then at D13, at D13, you wrote, or you typed, on page 14,157, you typed an 8 and a 9. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that 8 and 9, you wrote are 27% imbalanced. Is that right?
yes,
So you kept the 9 and not the 8. Is that right?
yes. That was another peak that I was concerned was the other limited data. I didn't know if it went with the person or with the instrument or an indication of a third.
Okay. So up here at D21 and D7S, 31.5%, it's not a pair, the 29 and 30. Is that correct?
Well, they could be, or they could not be. It could be from the instrument.
Okay. But you didn't use a 29-30 as a pair in your calculations.
No, I did not.
And right there at D7S, 35.7 is a pair.
Yes,
And then right here, 14-16, they're 48% and they're not a pair. Now we're higher, and we're almost to the 50% threshold of imbalance, correct?
yes.
If we'd have been 3% higher, it would have been a definite pair, right?
Not necessarily. I was looking at all of the samples, and each genetic marker kind of has a little personality of how they go through the PCR process. And with this, I was seeing the 14 and the 16 and a 15, they were switching places and heights, and I thought maybe that the 16 could be a part of the stutter from the big 18.
When you say you were looking at all of the samples, does that mean you were looking at B20A, B, C, D, E, F?
During the interpretation process, yes.
You were looking at all of those samples during the interpretation process.
Well, that's what that one summary sheet is.
And you were making decisions on B20E using all of the samples. That's what you just said.
Yes.
And then down here, this 8 and 9 that are 27.5% imbalanced, they're not a pair. That's important, isn't it?
Well, they could be a pair, but I was only going to compare to the 9 because I thought that it could be possibly another person or the instrument.
It's important because Russell Holbrook does not have an 8 at D13, does he?
No, he does not.
Right. And if that's a pair, that 8 and 9 is a pair, which you typed in on the STR summary sheet, then that's another location where David Russell Holbrook is excluded from leaving this foreign DNA. Isn't that correct?
Well, again, the summary sheet wasn't what I was basing things. I look at the actual electropherogram when I make my comparisons.
It's just below the 30% of one that you kept just a couple of minutes ago that we talked about, right?
Yes.
It's an 8 and a 9. Forget the STR summary sheet for just a second. I see an 8, I see a 9, and I see they're 27.5%. That's really close to the 30%, 30-some-odd% when you kept just a second ago as a pair, right?
Yes.
If that 8 and 9 go together at D13S, then Russell Holbrook is excluded from that B20E sample. Isn't that correct?
If they go together.
Because Russell Holbrook does not have a 9, does not have an 8
Objection.
at that location. Okay.
Overruled.
It's because Russell Holbrook does not have an 8 at D13.
That's correct. But he does have the 9 and 12.
Now, I'm going to go back to D8S, the very first one up at the top. That's the only foreign allele in this B20E sample of the first amplification that's above the stochastic threshold. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we just learned a rule a minute ago that if you have a peak above the stochastic threshold, that you should be confident that it's a heterozygote, correct?
Well, not necessarily. This is right above it. And knowing that the sample is older and degraded, I still might have lost information.
Where I just stuck my mouse, where I'm swiping with my mouse right there, that's about where the stochastic threshold. I forgot to put the red line on this one. But you agree that's where the stochastic threshold is?
Yes.
So it's above. It's 356th, correct?
Yes, but that doesn't mean that the person would be a 15-15.
But we just learned that if you're above the stochastic threshold, that's when you can call a single peak as a heterozygote. Is that correct?
No, because the 15 could be sharing with any of the 11 or the 13 or the stutter peaks.
Okay. But David, okay, so it could be a 15-11, a 15-15, or a 15-13, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Or with
Oh, I'm sorry.
or with the stutter peaks as well, because
Okay.
you can see they're all very similar in height.
Okay. So the choices there are 15-15, 15-13, or 15-11, as far as what we see above the stochastic threshold, right?
Well, I think it could go with any of the other peaks as well, even ones that aren't called like a 16.
You said that the other peak could be masked by Melissa Howard's standard, correct?
That could happen.
I want to focus on Melissa Howard's standard masking the other peak. If Melissa Howard's standard is masking the other peak, you either have a heterozygote of 15-15, or you got a 15-13, or a 15-11. If it's either one of those three, if it's a heterozygote or Melissa Howard is masking it, correct?
That's a possibility, but it could be with other peaks as well.
Did not call it 10 at that location.
No, I
Correct?
didn't.
Okay. You testified earlier that you believe that that stutter was masking from the 11, correct?
That's one of the possibilities.
Okay. Now, stutter is 6 to 12% of the larger peak. We've learned that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that would be between 145 and 291. I took 6% and 12% of that peak height, that's 2429. That means the stutter would be between 145 and 291 peak height. Is that correct?
Yes, I guess so.
And that is below 220, that 220 line that we see right in the middle. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, if it was stutter, what you're saying is it could be stutter, and you can't tell the difference between stutter and someone's DNA at that spot, correct?
Right.
Okay. If it was stutter, you would have stutter plus that person's DNA, wouldn't you?
Possibly, but again, it's an older sample, so it may have totally been gone.
So the 15's there, but the 10 could just be gone?
Well, that's why I have the 15 plus, because you can tell over the whole sample that things are very old and degraded, that I'm losing information.
But you would expect, if you have stutter plus someone's DNA, that would be higher than what that peak at around 220 is. Is that correct?
That's a possibility, yes.
And that's important, isn't it? That 10 is very important, isn't it?
Well, he does have that 10, yes.
Right. Okay, I'm going to show you okay. Your Honor, if I could approach the witness? Yes, sir. Okay. Ms. Hatler, I'm going to show you what I pre-marked as 1 through 4. And the first page is 14,200. Second page is 14,221. The third page is 14,200. Fifth page, or the fourth page is 14,213. Is that correct?
Okay.
Did I get, is one, pages 1 through 4. 14 to 10, 14 to 11, 14 to 12, and 14. Is that correct?
Yes.
These are the electropherograms of the second amplification.
Yes.
And the differences between the first two and the second two is the second two are zoomed in. Is that correct?
The second set is zoomed in.
Your Honor, I would move to put exhibits G1 through 4, defendant's exhibit G1 through 4 into evidence.
Objection. You 1 through 4 are admitted without objection.
Okay, and on the left side, this is the B20E, the second amplification that you did. You put more DNA into the amplification tube, then you amplified it, and then you ran it through the machine again. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm showing you page 14.210 and 14.211. Those are the first, that's the first printout. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I believe the scale of that is like 0 to 4,600.
Probably, yes.
And then you zoomed it in. It looks like similar to the other one. It goes 110, 220, 330, and then the next up would be 440. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to focus on D21 S11. and page 14212, where you zoomed in. That 2930 comes up again, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Again, if that were stutter coming from the 29, 6 to 12% of that, sorry, if it was stutter coming from the 30, 6 to 12% of that 30, which is a peak height of 344. 12% of 344, that's 41, correct?
Yes.
So we're well above that 12% threshold. We're at 86 peak height, correct?
Yes.
25%. 86 divided by 344 is 25%, correct?
Yes.
So by your definition of stutter being 6 to 12%, that is not stutter. Is that correct?
Well, I was thinking that it could possibly be stutter from the 28.
Okay.
So sometimes you can have a combination of it. But if it goes that direction from the 28, it's a much smaller percentage than the 10%.
Way, way smaller, right?
Usually between 3 and 5.
Russell does not have a 29. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if that 29 goes with that 30, at that D8S position, then Russell Holbrook would be excluded from leaving this B20E sample, even the second amplification. Is that correct?
Right, he does not have the 29.
And you would agree that that 29, it's reproducible.
Yes, it did come up on both of them.
Okay. Just for purposes of, I had to add some exhibits after I created them. I'm going to try to put in 17199 and 17487. I'm going to attach those to Exhibit D, and they're going to be D5 and D6 pre-marked. Okay. And Mrs. Hatler, I'm going to show you what's marked as page 17199 and 17487. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay, and I've marked those as D5 and D6. They're going to go, we'll
like
get,
behind that.
yeah, we'll get it all in it because it's going to. And these are pages from the April 3rd, 2015 biology standard operating procedure and the February 5th, 2016 biology standard operating procedure. Is that correct?
Okay.
Your Honor, I would move to enter D5 and D6 into evidence.
No objection.
Yeah. And for the record, it's defendants D5 and D6.
Be so marked and they'll be entered as such.
Okay. I've put both of these side by side because as you were doing the stuff in this case, it switched from one standard operating procedure to the other. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. But what I'm wanting to focus on, in one of them, it's Rule 47.3.10.1.2. And the other one, it's 49.3.10.1.2. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Those, look at that, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. The rule of that text is exactly the same in both standard operating procedures.
Yes.
What happened is Unit 47 got pushed to Unit 49 when they got changed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. No changes in this rule. And that rule states, minor contributors may less frequently be resolved when two or more contributors are present. A minor profile will not be resolved at any loci if one or both of the alleles for the minor profile are below the stochastic threshold unless an assumption of 2 contributors is established and reported. Minor contributors may often be unresolvable, although a major contributor to the same mixture is readily determined. Do you agree that that's what it says?
Yes.
It says a minor profile, which is what we have in this case. You have a major profile, which is Melissa Howard, correct?
Yes.
Okay. You have a minor profile.
I'm just going to get rid of this.
A minor profile will not be resolved at any loci if one or both of the alleles for the minor profile are below the stochastic threshold, unless there's an assumption of 2 contributors. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. You just testified earlier that there are 3 contributors to D20E. Is that right?
Well, I was assuming that there was 2 with a possible additional contributor.
2 plus something is 3. You don't have a partial person, do you?
Yes, I understand.
2 plus another contributor is 3. Is that correct?
Well, it's a possible contributor. I wasn't sure if it was from the instrument or if it was a real donor.
So you just made an assumption that it was 2 people.
Well, yes, I have to make these assumptions because I don't have standards at that point. I'm just trying to put the pieces together.
So you needed the standard before you could determine whether it's 2 or 3 people?
No, I have to make all these conclusions before I can compare anything to a standard.
It just sounded like you said you were having to make those assumptions because you hadn't gotten the standard yet. So you get the standard first and then you decide whether it's 2 or 3 people?
No, I always make my determinations from the sample and then do any comparisons later.
But you got 2 plus something, that's 3, and you're making an assumption of 2 contributors. Because you have to, because this rule doesn't allow you to go below the stochastic threshold if there's more than 2 contributors. Isn't that correct?
Right, you have to have 2 contributors to make the calculations, yes.
I could approach the witness, Your Honor. Yeah. Mrs. Hatler, I have here pages 17,201 and 17,400. Mark those as D7 through D8.
Yes.
And the first page is a page from the April 3rd, 2015 standard operating procedure, and the second page is from the February 5th, 2016 standard. Correct?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would move, I believe it's D7 and D8 into, defendants D7 and D8 into evidence.
No objection.
Okay. Similarly, Ms. Hatler, because there's 2 different standard operating procedures, I put 2 pages up here. What I want to focus on is what's in red. It's Rule 47.3.11.7.1 in the earlier operating procedure, and it's Rule 49.3.11.7.1 in the later operating procedure. You agree?
Yes.
Okay. And they say the exact same thing. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And what that says is a sample is not interpretable when there is data at limited areas and is generally within 50 to 75 RFUs of the analytical threshold. Is that correct?
Yes.
Low-level data resolved from a mixture is frequently not interpretable as it's not possible to determine the number of contributors to the low-level data. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Their analytical threshold is 50 for what we're dealing with here, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that means anything from 100 to 125 falls within this rule, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, a sample is not interpretable when there's data at limited areas and is generally within 100 to 125 peak heights, correct?
Yes, that's what it says.
Okay. Low-level data resolved from a mixture is frequently not interpretable as it's not possible to determine the number of contributors to that low-level data. Isn't that what it says?
Yes, but there's some information above it that talks about the different sample types.
Okay. Right there, at D3S, you called that a 16 plus, is that correct?
At the end, I did not do any statistical calculations to that sample.
It's an 89.
Yes, the RFU is 89.
Right, the peak height's 89. Right there, we've got the 10, 11. You type that in, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. And those are both in that same range, is that right?
yes, but that first 18 peak from her is much higher, and I thought that maybe there could be some stutter effects from that sample. But yes, they are the similar RFUs.
Yeah. They're below that, one of them's below the 100, and they're both between that 100 and 125 range we were just talking about in that rule, is that correct?
Yes.
I have here, Your Honor, if I could approach the witness. I have here exhibit, remarked as exhibit D9, page 17203 and page 17490, is that correct?
Yes.
And again, one of them is from the April 2015 Standard Operating Procedure, and the other one is from the February 2016 Standard
Yes.
You didn't, but I pulled it up. It's fine. No objection.
You wish to place those into evidence, sir?
Yes, Your Honor, I would place D9, defendant
Without objection.
Okay. I've highlighted what's Rule 47.3.13.4.2 and 49.3.13.4.2. Is that correct?
Yes.
And similarly, both say the same thing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what they say, loci with alleles below the stochastic threshold will not be used for inclusion statistics unless an assumption of the number of contributors is made. Is that correct?
Yes.
And as you sit here today, sometimes it's 2 contributors, sometimes it's 3 contributors. Isn't that correct?
I've stated that I was assuming that there was 2 with a possible additional contributor.
Okay. We'll move on. Okay. I want to talk about, this is page 14,157. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I want to talk about things on here that do not match Russell Holbrook. You see that red X that I have at D8S?
Yes.
Okay. You don't have a 10 there, do you?
No.
Okay. See that 29 that's highlighted in red?
Yes.
Russell doesn't have a 29, does he?
No, he does not.
Okay. At D3S, that 15 that you saw in the second amplification, Russell doesn't have that, does he? He doesn't have a 15 at that location.
No, he does not.
Okay. At D13, Russell doesn't have an 8 at that location. Is that correct?
No, he does not have the 8.
That's why those decisions that you made at D8S, D21, D3S, and D13, that's why those are important. Isn't that correct?
Yes, because I was trying to figure out what the sample was, again, before I had any standards.
Okay. Now I'm going to zoom out, and this is, sorry. Okay, we do have that. This is the top half of page 14,157, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And this is the STR summary sheet that you prepared. You didn't put B20A on there because there was no foreign DNA at all, is that correct?
Right, this is one of the summary sheets.
Similarly, I'm not going to go through every one of these samples like we just did with B20E. Similarly, you typed in the foreign DNA that you found at each one of those locations on September 23rd, 2015, correct?
Well, what I typed in was only what was in additional to Melissa Howard's DNA profile.
What
So
I mean-
there are some stuff that could be sharing. This was only stuff that was additional to hers.
Right. What I mean is B20B foreign, B20C foreign, B20D foreign, B20E foreign. You typed in what was foreign to Melissa Howard, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. At D8S, where that red X is, you're missing an 11, is that right? On B20B, I'm sorry, right here on B20B. You don't have an 11 at D8S, is that correct?
No, there's only a 15.
Okay. Right below that, there's a 29, is that correct?
Yes.
Russell doesn't have a 29 at D21, does he?
No, he does not.
Russell doesn't have a 12 or 13 at D7S, does he?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I'm sorry. Russell doesn't have a 12 or 13 at D7S, does he?
No, he does not.
Right up here on B20B. Right down below that is CFS. Russell doesn't have a 10, does he?
No, he does not.
Okay. And you wrote in from the second amplification on November 3rd, 2015. That's the blue that you wrote in, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And at D3S, Russell doesn't have a 15, is that correct?
No, he does not.
And at THO1, Russell doesn't have a 7.
No, he doesn't.
Okay. And at D13S, Russell doesn't have a 14.
Right.
And at BWA, Russell doesn't have a 16.
No, he doesn't.
Down here at FGA, Russell doesn't have a 21, does he?
No.
Similarly, over here on B20C foreign, Russell doesn't have a 14 at D8S, is that correct?
Well, this sample, I had determined that it was not interpretable.
But at D8S, Russell doesn't have a 14, does he?
No, he does not.
You typed a 14 in from that B20C first electropharogram, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay. Right over here at D3S on B20C, that foreign, Russell doesn't have a 15, is that correct?
No, he does not.
And at D16, where that X is, Russell would need to have a 10, wouldn't he?
Yes, the 10 is not there.
There's no 10 there. At D2S, Russell would need a 20, is that right?
Yes, he's a 1720.
Right. There's no 20 there, is there?
No.
D20D foreign. Right up there at the top, D8S. Russell doesn't have a 12 there, does he?
No, he does not.
Okay. At D3S, Russell doesn't have a 15, does he?
No, he does not.
Right below that, at THO1, you're missing a 9.3, is that correct?
Right, that did not come up.
And similar, we've already talked about B20E foreign in the previous slide. Okay. Now I'm going to move to the bottom half of that STR summary sheet, okay? on B20F foreign at Tho 1, missing an 8, is that correct?
Right, there's no 8.
And on B20G foreign at D7S, missing a 10, is that correct?
Correct.
At D16S, where that X is, right here, you're missing an 11, is that correct?
Right.
And the X should probably be on the other side of the 10 because you put them in order. And I just put the X in the wrong place, right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right here at TPOX, Russell doesn't have a 16, does he?
At BWA,
I'm sorry, you're right. VWA, I apologize. In VWA, Russell doesn't have a 16, does he?
no, he does not.
And right below that at TPOX, Russell doesn't have a 7 or 11. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I'm just going to go through the B1A, B, and C. That was was that the pajama pants?
Those were the socks and the ponytail holder.
You've excluded Russell from those, is that correct?
Anything foreign wasn't interpretable. You can see it's very limited information.
I want to come back up here, okay? I noticed something when I looked at this sheet. I see that 30, that really important decision at D21. I see that 29 popping up. It's popping up on B20B and B20E. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And we also see it pop up on B20G. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And at D13S, oh, never mind. Okay, so in B20B, if that 29 goes with that 30, Russell would be excluded from leaving that foreign profile. Is that correct?
Well, with that profile, I determined that there was 3 donors to the sample. So that is why I could neither include him nor exclude him. He does not have the 29, but he did have the 30.
So because you made the assumption that there were 3 people, it became an inclusion only. Is that correct?
An exclusion only.
All right, and right. You could only include or exclude.
I could not include, I could only exclude.
Okay. So because you made a determination at B20B that there were 3 donors, meaning Melissa Howard plus 2 other people,
Yes.
so if Russell Holbrook he's got a 20, he's not a 2930 at D21, is that correct?
Right.
Okay. So Russell Holbrook could not have left that foreign DNA?
For B,
Or B, yes.
well, but he does have the 30, and if there's potentially 2 foreigns, then he could be not excluded from that sample.
When you say there's 3 donors, that really means 3 or more, doesn't it? It could be a 4th donor and you don't know, a 5th donor.
That can happen. It can be difficult to determine the number of contributors.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a recess at this time, and so we'll be in recess for approximately 15 minutes' time. recess 15 minutes, thank you.